everyone. Great to see you back with us again. So after a brief break, we are now back with a new series, a new Bible study, and we are glad that you have been able to rejoin us. As you would have seen from the introduction, we are now going to be studying the life of Moses. Now I believe that most people who are viewing this video, most of you probably have a very good idea already about who Moses is and his story as told in the Bible. So it's not going to be anything new to you in terms of the actual events in the life of Moses. And we are certainly not going to be going through the books Exodus and Deuteronomy. We're not going to be going through the books verse by verse, chapter by chapter. We'll just be highlighting certain events that would have occurred in the life of Moses. And we'll try to put them in some historical context, give you some background that might allow us as we study together to understand better why certain things may have happened the way they did from a human perspective. Because we know that it happened the way they did because God planned it that way. But God works these things using human intervention and human thinking and so on. And so we'll be looking at these events. There will be some history, in particular as we start the story. As you know, Moses was born in Egypt. So there'll be some history aligning the history of Egypt along with the Bible story, which will give us some understanding of the people who may have influenced the life of Moses. But as we go on further into the story, there'll be less of that. So don't worry, it's not going to be too much history for you. The idea, of course, is that as we look at these stories, as we look at the life of Moses, we want to learn from that. We want to learn from his experience, from the things that happened to him, and see how God used him, how God trained him. And hopefully those things, as we learn them, would have an impact on our own Christian lives to make us better Christians. And in some ways, they help us to be like Moses in some aspects of his life. But most of all, they help us to be more like the Lord Jesus. And so we trust that as we go through, there will be lessons learned that would help us to develop and to become better Christians. Okay, so where do we begin? Well, let's go back to the birth of Moses and let's try to understand the historical background and the prevailing conditions that would have been in place in Egypt prior to his birth. So actually today we're not going to be talking about the birth of Moses. That's actually going to come in more detail in our next class. But today we'll just look at the background leading up to his birth. Okay, so if we look to get some kind of marker, we can probably figure out the timing, that what year approximately Moses was born. And we can use as a marker the Exodus, because we are told that later on, as we read through the book of Exodus, we know that Moses was 80 years old at the time of the Exodus. So if we could find out approximately when the Exodus took place, then that will give us an idea as to when Moses was born. And as it turns out, we do have a pretty good idea as to when the Exodus took place. We are given a fairly definitive statement found in the book of 1 Kings chapter 6. Now this 1 Kings 6 is when the temple is being built and dedicated by Solomon. And we are told there, and I'll read that part for you, 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt," that's the Exodus, "in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Zith, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." That Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in the 4th year of his reign. And without going into too much detail and background, we know pretty much the dates of Solomon's reign. And the 4th year of Solomon's reign coincides with 966 BC. All right, just take it from me, and you can check it out. But 966 BC is the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So we're told here in chapter 6 and verse 1 that took place 480 years after the Exodus. So let's work backwards. 480 years plus 966 gives us 1446. So the Exodus took place, we will figure out, in 1446 BC. Now, it wouldn't surprise you to know that not everyone agrees with this date. This is referred to by some as the early Exodus date. And that's because some people believe that the Exodus took place a couple hundred years later than this, which is known as the late Exodus date. And those persons who hold to the late date, obviously they do not see the 480 years mentioned in 1 Kings 6 as literal. They see that as being some kind of symbolic figure. And so they don't do the straight calculation as we just did. And they have other reasons to argue for a late date. But for the purposes of our study, for our class, we'll just take it as is given there in the Bible. 180 years plus 966, 1446. And we'll take that as the date of the Exodus. So we're going with the early Exodus date. Right? And we're told also, as we go through Moses' story, that he was 80 years old approximately at the time of the Exodus. And so if you, again, go back 80 years, you are going to get 80 plus 1446 gives you 1526 BC. So based on those calculations, Moses was born approximately 1526 BC. All right. Now, if you now look at Egyptian history, 1526 BC aligns with what is known as, in Egypt's history, the 18th dynasty. Now, if you look at, again, Egypt's history, you'll find that it is broken up into dynasties. And so you read the 12th dynasty, the 13th dynasty, and to make it all even more confusing, these dynasties don't always follow sequentially. You may have 2 dynasties running concurrently. So it's all very complicated in some areas. Don't worry about it. There's no exam at the end of this course. Just if you're interested, you can do further reading on it. But for the purposes of our study, just know that we are assuming, based on our calculations, that Moses would have been born during the 18th dynasty of Egypt. And the 18th dynasty is a pretty interesting dynasty. There are a number of pharaohs in that dynasty who are quite interesting, and some who you may have heard of. For example, you may have heard of a pharaoh called Akhenaten. He is quite well known by people who follow some of these Egyptians' historical references. He did some interesting things for Egypt. So he's quite well known. He was a pharaoh in that 18th dynasty. And another one who you may have heard of is Tutankhamun, whose tomb was found back in the 1920s, around there. He was also a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. So I mentioned those two. These two have no bearing at all on our story. I just mentioned them because, you know, they're part of the 18th dynasty. You may have heard of them, just so to give you that context. But there are other pharaohs in that dynasty who we would find interesting because they do play a part in the life of Moses. And so we have 1526, approximately the 18th dynasty. And so Moses is born in Egypt in around 1526 BC. But how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where the children of Israel are in Egypt? Now again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the story. I'll just do a very quick synopsis of it, just in case some person isn't that familiar. And I'll start with Joseph. Joseph was sold by his brothers because of jealousy. He was sold into slavery to the Egyptians. Whilst in Egypt, he was sold to a man called Potiphar, who Joseph worked for, and he worked diligently, well loved by Potiphar because of his diligent work and so on. As Joseph grew older, approximately the age 30 or so, obviously grew up into a very nice looking young man, he caught the eye of Potiphar's wife, and she approached him to have a sexual liaison with him. But Joseph, being an upright young man, rejected her advances, and so she, in a fit of anger and jealousy or whatever, falsely accused Joseph of attempting to sexually assault her, which of course was not true. So she obviously reported Joseph to her husband, Potiphar, who had Joseph cast into prison. Many would argue that this indicated that Potiphar probably did not believe his wife, because if he did believe her, he probably would have had Joseph executed on the spot or very soon thereafter. But because she was his wife, he had to go along with the story, so he had Joseph cast into prison, probably with the intention of getting him out at the earliest convenient time. But that's kind of speculation, but I think it's good speculation. Nevertheless, Joseph is in prison, and again, the diligent word, he comes to the attention of the prison guard, and he is given privileges in prison. Whilst there, he meets the Pharaoh's butler and baker, who had dreams, and Joseph, by God's direction, is able to interpret those dreams correctly. Eventually, the butler returns to working for Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a dream. No one could interpret it. The butler says, "Oh, I know a man, Joseph, who is in prison." Joseph is brought out of prison. He interprets Pharaoh's dream. And because of he's able to do that, he's able to prophesy correctly that there will be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and Egypt is able to prepare during the 7 years of plenty. And the king, the Pharaoh at the time, makes Joseph his second in command, his prime minister. The correct term would be, he would be his vizier. That's the term that would have been used for Joseph's position. Now, I need to stop here and tell you a bit about a group of people known as the Hyksos. Stay with me. I know it's history. I know it can be boring at times, but it's important for me to mention the Hyksos. The Hyksos were a group of wandering people, wandering tribe, who were of Semitic heritage. In other words, they were descended from Shem, Noah's son Shem, just as the Israelites are descended from Shem. So they were like kind of cousins to the Israelites. They both had a common ancestor, Shem. So they were Semitic, they were wanderers, and they invaded Egypt around the 15th and 16th dynasties. Now, by invaded, I do not mean a military invasion. It just appears as though they moved in en masse, and they, over a period of time, accumulated great power and great position, to the extent that eventually there were rulers of Egypt. This is probably one of the only times in Egyptian history where they were ruled by a foreign entity. And the Hyksos, again, not Egyptian, they were Semitic, accumulated much power, and eventually they were rulers of Egypt. And so the pharaohs of that 15th and 16th dynasties were pharaohs of Hyksos descent, not native Egyptians. And it is felt that the pharaoh at the time of Joseph, the one who Joseph would have elevated Joseph and made him prime minister, vizier, was one of these Hyksos kings, one of these Hyksos pharaohs. And quite possibly because they were, as I said, cousins, he may have looked favorably on Joseph for that reason, in addition to his ability to interpret dreams. And so the Hyksos were rulers of Egypt for that 15th and 16th dynasties. As we come to the end of the 17th dynasty, however, a new pharaoh, a new person arose who eventually became pharaoh, and he was able to drive the Hyksos out of Egypt. And he establishes what is then known as the 18th dynasty that we mentioned earlier, under which Moses was born. This pharaoh is known as Ahmose the First, and he, as I said, was the one who would have led the revolt to oust or evict the Hyksos from Egypt and establish, as I said, that 18th dynasty. And so Joseph is now in Egypt. He is now the vizier. And remember, as I mentioned before, there's a period of 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. During that 7 years of famine, because Joseph's family, who were still not in Egypt at that point in time, food was short, so he was able to get them to come down to Egypt. And as they arrived there, the Pharaoh gave them some land in Goshen where they were able to live and establish themselves with their flocks. And now the family of Jacob, the Israelite family, are now living in Egypt. And this is how it comes to be that when we reach 1526, Moses is born in Egypt. Okay, so Amos the first established the 18th dynasty. As I said, he was the one who drove out the Hyksos, and it's quite likely, quite possible, that he is the one who is mentioned in the book of Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, where it mentions there that there arose a new king who knew not Joseph. I'll just read that verse for you. In verse 8 of Exodus 1, it says, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." Now, by not knowing Joseph doesn't indicate that he had no idea who Joseph was. He never heard of him. That's not what it indicates. It means he knew who he was, but he had no regard for Joseph. He had no respect for Joseph, because he would have associated Joseph with the Hyksos kings, the Hyksos pharaohs. He would have seen Joseph as being part of that administration. And so, having expelled the Hyksos kings and associating Joseph with those kings, then he had no regard for Joseph. He had no intention of ever honoring Joseph's name, and certainly he had no intention of honoring Joseph's people. And so, as I said, likely Amos the first established the 18th dynasty, and now Egyptians are once again ruling Egypt. And so Amos now is in charge, and he's probably thinking to himself, you know what, I have evicted or expelled these Hyksos, but they might come back. They might go, they might regroup, they might get some additional military help and return. Not only that, they are Semitic, these Hyksos, and I have some people who are dwelling here in Egypt as well who are also Semitic, kind of close cousins, so to speak, as I mentioned earlier. And so Amos would have said, if these Hyksos come back and attack us, they very well may be joined by the Israelites, who are their cousins, and they may also rise up and join with the Hyksos and defeat us. And so he is very concerned about that, and so he decides that he needs to do something about the Israelite population. He needs to control that population. He needs to make sure that they are in no position to rise up against him, and just in case those Hyksos comes back, they're not in a position to join the Hyksos to overthrow him and his dynasty. Now, how do we know that? Well, he literally says that for us here in Exodus chapter 1. He doesn't mention the Hyksos in the Bible here, but knowing the history, we could infer that that's what he had in mind. And so we read in verse 9 of Exodus 1. This is the Pharaoh speaking, again, assumed to be Amos the first. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. And so he is concerned that the Israelites will join his enemies and overthrow him. And so he has to control them. He put some plans in place to control the population of Israel. The first thing he does is in verse 11, where he now enslaves the Israelites and seeks to work them, keep them under subjection by hard work. Verse 11 says, therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramesses. And it says there, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. So, plan A, afflict the Israelites by slavery and hard work. That will control the population. Well, verse 12 tells us plan A did not work, because the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved, this is the Egyptians, were grieved because of the children of Israel. So, plan A failed. They now have to go to plan B. And so, verse 13 says, and the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. And all the service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. That's plan A. Plan A failed. Verse 15, plan B. Because plan A no longer relevant, didn't work, let's go to plan B. Okay, so plan A has failed, and now we go to plan B. Plan B was to get the Hebrew midwives, that when the Hebrew women were at the point of delivery, if the child was a boy, to kill that child. If it was a girl, to let that girl to live. We are told in verse 15, it says there, and the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. So again, plan B, get the midwives to kill the boys. Plan B also failed. Verse 17 said, but the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. So these women were obviously women of high moral character, and they feared God. They did not fear the word of the king, and so they kept the boys alive. So plan B also failed, and God rewarded them. The king of Egypt called to the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. So they were blessed by God because they obeyed God and kept those boy children alive. So plan B has failed, plan C, and plan C is like a desperation plan. Simply, anytime a boy is born, get someone to throw them into the river and drown them. That's plan C. As we see in verse 22, and Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. So desperation plan C. Plan A failed, plan B failed. Plan C, just throw the boys into the Nile as they are born. And so this is the environment that prevailed when Moses was born. He's born into an environment where the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, is attempting to kill all the Hebrew boys. And so he is born during that time. Next class, we'll actually get into the birth of Moses and the circumstances surrounding his birth and the miraculous way that God preserved him. So what is today's lesson from this brief study that we have had? It was quite interesting as we came towards the close there. We saw the plans and the schemes of the Pharaoh, how he attempted to put his plans in place to eliminate, to get rid of God's people. And so he had his plans. He had his plan A, he had his plan B, both of them failed, and he had plan C, which also failed, which we'll discuss next time. And so we have the plans of the Pharaoh, or the strategies of the Pharaoh or the schemes of the Pharaoh. But above all that, we have the plans of God. And God had a plan. God had a plan for his people. And his plan was that his people would multiply, they would grow, and that at a particular point, there would be some person who would be born who would be a deliverer of his people. That person obviously was Moses. And Amos and his successors and the other pharaohs who would have tried to stop that plan from coming into place failed, because man's schemes can never overrule God's plans. And that is such a comfort to us today as Christians. We live in a world where people have plans. We have political leaders, military leaders, and they all have their plans for what they want, how they want this world to progress. And they form their alliances, that they form their big organizations, and they have their particular individuals who they promote as the persons who would direct this world in the way that they want. And that's their scheme. That's their strategy. But we as Christians take comfort in knowing that our God has a plan. And God's plan cannot be stopped. It cannot be sidetracked. It cannot be thwarted. God's plan will come to pass. And so as Christians, as we see these things happening in the world, and we see the schemes of mankind, of leaders and so on, so-called powerful people, we don't have to be afraid, because we know that God's plan for us will come to pass. And we know that as Christians, God's plan for us is for one day we will be with him. As Christians, we may disagree as to how we will get there and what will happen in between that time, between now and eventually. But we all agree that we will get there and that we will one day be with our God. And we look forward to that day. And knowing that no plan, no scheme, no strategy of man can stop that from happening. And so Christians, take comfort. Take comfort as a Christian, take comfort as an individual. Again, God has a plan for you, and no one can derail God's plan for you. We look forward to seeing how God will work things out in the life of the Israelites and Moses, even as we see how he works things out in our lives day by day. If you are not a Christian, God has a plan for you, and that plan is for you to come to know him through his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Why not call upon him? Because whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Call on him today. My friends, I will see you at next class. We'll discuss, as I said, the birth of Moses and some very interesting things from a historical perspective. We trust that you will be able to join us then, and we look forward to next time. Until then, God bless you.